there's this compat settings concept. I know you've blogged once or maybe twice now about that. That's a very common comment that came in. You want to talk about that?
That was a heated one, right? That was a controversial issue for at least a year or so, right? I think that I can't remember if that came out as a controversial issue after Ecma 376 was finalized. I think that all of those things kind of were dumped during the initial part of the ISO process. So what this was is it's actually specific to word processing ML. It didn't affect spreadsheet ML or presentation ML. There's a collection of about 100 or 200 compatibility settings that have just accumulated over the years for word processing documents. And the reason that these things are usually introduced are that as in Microsoft Word, version to version, we would go and either fix bugs or add new behaviors that would affect the look of somebody's document. And so in order to allow people who had existing documents that they didn't want the look to change, we would have compatibility settings essentially saying, do things like the older version did, right? Mm-hmm. And the vast majority of these compatibility settings were fully documented in the Ecma spec. I mean, 90-95% of them. There were a host of them where the setting really was, use this older behavior of this application. It wasn't any more prescriptive than that, and that's where we started to get a lot of feedback on, right? When we were initially creating Ecma 376, and actually even before at Microsoft, before we even submitted the document to Ecma, we talked about whether or not the compatibility settings were something that should go into the spec. And our view was that since they are going to be present in documents, right, and the purpose of this format is to allow people to go and migrate the old binary documents into this new XML world, it would be we thought that we'd probably get some negative feedback if we kept those kind of to ourselves and didn't go and put them into the standard. So we went and created a section for all of them, put them into the standard, documented all of the ones that we kind of knew about, but there were some other ones that were essentially, there would be bug fixes in the product. It actually wasn't even new functionality. It was just like a version of Word, or even there's some like Word Perfect, but had some bug with the way that it would do like line layout or things like that, right? And so we would have a setting saying do line layout like this older product.
And is that a converted document? Is that how that ends up there? That it was created in Word
exactly,
Perfect?
Exactly. Yeah. It was created in Word Perfect, or they're migrating a file from an older version to a new, and the new version says, oh, this is from that older version, so I'm going to go and set this compatibility flag. And it's from a Microsoft standpoint, they're a big time pain, right? Because you have to maintain these different behaviors, and we try and do everything we can to encourage people to fully upgrade their file and essentially turn off all the compatibility settings. But there are some documents that'll still have them, right? We fully documented everything, but about I think there are about 10 of these things that we had some basic documentation on, but didn't fully describe the behavior. And I think that the reason why it was a red flag for people was because it would mention a behavior from an older product and didn't fully define it.
Yes,
so
it sounds proprietary when
absolutely.
It says auto space like Word 95 or something.
Yeah, so we understood why. I mean, we understood the uproar around it, right? But at the same time, we had thought initially that most people aren't really going to care about these, so it's probably not that big of a deal. But we were wrong, and a lot of people cared about them, obviously. So what we did is at Microsoft, we went back to try and find out kind of what the behaviors were, and then worked with TC45 on how to actually document those behaviors. And so in the final round of dispositions that came out on the 14th of January, we now have all of those compatibility settings. We have those all fully defined. And so, I think that in the long run, that was clearly the right thing to do. I mean, it did make sense to have them in the standard and not have them defined. The other approach that I was talking about that we could have taken was just, not including them at all in the spec, but that definitely doesn't help interoperability, right? Mm-hmm. You could say, maybe it doesn't hurt interoperability because most people don't care to use them in the first place. But for the people that do care to use them, it's nice to have them documented. And if you go and look through the compatibility settings, there are a number of them that are actually pretty valid behaviors that people may want to go and use, right? So it's good that they're documented. The other approach of not including them was what was used by like Open Office when they went and submitted their format to Oasis. They just left. They didn't include those in the standard. Instead, they just used an extensibility mechanism in ODF, so that they could just go and add their own properties. But they have these too. Open Office has 100 or so of these compatibility settings. But they're just their approach was just don't have them in the standard, so it won't really draw attention to them or cause any negative feelings. So aside from documenting them, the other thing that we decided to do, which I think kind of helped ease both sides, because there were people that were asking for us just to remove them completely from the standard, and I mean that was something that from the point of view at Microsoft, it wasn't really as big of a deal, but from TC45 it's a pretty big deal because we had customers like BP and Statoil and Barclays Capital. These guys, one of the many reasons why they cared about working in the standardization is that they wanted to have the standard that fully defined everything in their formats, so that if they wanted to someday in the future switch over to using a different product, they could, and that other product would have the ability to read the files as well, right? So for them, leaving things out was kind of a non-starter, right? So the kind of compromise that we found was to, one, fully document them, but also extract them from the main part of the spec and put them into a deprecated annex, where it's really clear that these things are only here for this like transitional period, right? There's this transition that we're going through where we're moving these legacy binary docs forward into Open XML, right? But there's going to be a bunch of stuff in those legacy docs that aren't necessarily going to be used in documents of the future. So while Open XML is going to continue to evolve and add new features and become a document format for the future, it also has this design goal of allowing for this transition. So a lot of the functionality that is solely for that transition and should not be used in new documents, we have in this deprecated annex now. And then that means that people implementing the spec, it's really clear to them, look, here's all the information, it's fully documented, there's no black boxes here or anything, right? But if you're creating new documents, you shouldn't use these. These are only for documents that already exist. When you come across these settings, here's what you do.
And a lot of these settings are things that aren't really part of the say word processing ML view of how to represent the rendering of a document. Like they're kind of, as I understand it, they're kind of oddball things that it's not like just change the font to a different font or change the color or change line spacing.
Oh yeah,
kind of unusual things that you couldn't represent in the markup itself if you were to try that approach, right?
Yeah, that's one of the other suggestions that people had was they were suggesting that rather than have these compatibility settings in the first place, why not just use the other properties that exist in the document, right? There's properties about font and sizing and stuff like that. Why do you have to have this compatibility setting? These compatibility settings are, they're kind of odd behaviors, right? They aren't things that you can go and specify with existing properties. And adding existing properties specifically for representing this, it just confuses the spec, and they aren't really needed, right? In addition to that, it is just it's an overriding behavior on top of what's already applied to your document, right? So the last thing you want to do is, in order to have this compatibility, you go and you tweak all of the font settings, right? And then you've just completely changed all of the document. And then if you want to go turn that thing off, like what font settings do you go back to, right? Like,
yeah.
So really, it's just a one flag that kind of changes a specific behavior. But yeah, that was something that I know some folks had hoped that would be an alternative, is just going and using other existing properties that are already there. But yeah, that's not an option, unfortunately.